Hello everybody and welcome to the Prognard. I am your host, Jacob Williams. Today I want to start the first video in what I'm going to call the Armchair General series. And what I kind of imagine these series of videos being is what I talked about in my second channel update. These will be a series of videos where I'm going to take either some game mechanic or I'm going to look at some play I recently made in a game and I want to try and do some sort of mathematical or critical thinking analysis on it. So for this video, I'm going to talk about a situation that occurred a couple of days ago when I was playing someone at Twilight Struggle here locally. So let me explain the board setup. Obviously I didn't take a picture of the game state when this particular situation happened, and even if I had, I think it would be really distracting, for you guys, the viewer, to see a bunch of chits and numbers everywhere. So kind of what I've done is I've tried to replicate the important things on the map that are critical to what I want to talk about, and it's a little less detailed. So what I've done here is any region where you see two red beads, that's where USSR had domination, and a single bead, red bead, means Russia had presence there, and then the same thing with the blue beads. That means that's a place where the US had presence. Okay. And then in this particular game, I was the USSR and my opponent was the Americans. And then what I'm going to talk about occurred around turn 5. And then the VPs at this point in time were somewhere around 14. I forget the exact VP score when this play happened, but it was roughly around there. Okay, so I was doing quite well in the game at this point. Okay, so what exactly happened in this game? Well, what I started seeing was, and what typically is the case with Twilight Struggle, is that the Russians tend to run roughshod over the U.S. until about the mid-war, and things start turning around. And then by the late war, I feel that the U.S. events are a lot better than the Russian events, and they can really turn things around. And the one bad thing with these glass beads is it kind of oversimplifies the situation. So even though we both had presence in Asia, my opponent was really close to dominating that area, and they could have scored really well on a Southeast Asia scorecard. Okay, so in this situation, even though I was at, in the top row of points, I was definitely in the top row. I just can't remember if I was at 13, 14, or 15. But I was in a situation where I felt like the momentum in the game was about to turn around quickly, so I wanted to try to get those last few points in order to put the game away and get a win. All right, so what happened, or what's the event that I want to talk about here? Well, because I wanted to get those last few points in, I was desperately searching my hand for anything that would score me points, and then I see this card. Okay. Oh, and I need to put one other thing here to set the mood. 1 second. I forgot to mention that at this particular point in the game, here is where DEF CON was. It was at 2. Alright, so anyway, so I'm looking for cards in my hand to score those last few points, and I have this card in my hand. Summit. Both players roll a die. Each adds 1 for each region they dominate or control. Higher roll gains 2 VPs and may move DEF CON 1 level in either direction. Do not re-roll ties. Alright. So, I was thinking to myself, is this a good card to play? And hopefully you guys can see why I might be hesitant, because if I lose the roll-off, well then my opponent's going to go to DEF CON 1, and since I was the acting player, it would be like I caused DEF CON 1 to happen, and I would have instantly lost the game. But look at the map. I'm dominating in 3 regions, and my opponent is not dominating any of them. All right, so I'm going to get a +3 to my roll. So I'm trying to calculate the probabilities in my head and figure out, is this worth the risk or not? Okay, my intuition was telling me a +3 is pretty good, and it's going to be really unlikely that I will lose. You know, but anytime, I mean, let me back up. I wasn't going to be an a-hole and stop in the middle of the game, break out pad and paper and calculate, you know, the exact probability. I think the spirit of games is you kind of have to go with what your gut's telling you, or whatever quick mathematical calculations you can do in your head. So, before I tell you what actually happened, let's actually take a second. Now that I wouldn't be an a-hole to interrupt the game and do the math, let's actually do some of this math. And I'm going to show you 2 ways you could do this. And again, I don't recommend you doing this in the middle of a game, but what this helps to do is kind of see some classic probability techniques, and maybe it'll help hone your gut feeling more into reality. So the first method I'm going to do here is probably the most math intensive, and I'm going to do a back of the envelope calculation. Well, maybe more accurately, I'm going to do a front of the envelope calculation. All right, let me see if I can get this into frame better, because I know you guys tune into a YouTube video to see some math. Well, first of all, let's think about the scenarios in which I would lose. Okay, I've got a +3 advantage. So if I roll a 1, okay, then what does my opponent have to roll? So if I roll a 1, then my opponent only has to roll a 5 or a 6 in order to win. Okay, and then if I roll a 2, then my opponent can only roll, or has to roll a 6 in order to beat me, right? Because if I add +3, then that's a 5, and we don't count ties. So they have to strictly roll a 6. And whereas here they can't roll a 4, because when I add the +3, we tie, and so on and so forth. So hopefully that's clear and intuitive as I break this down. Okay, and when we're doing this probability, we kind of have to break it up into, oops, sorry about that. We have to break it down into the 2 cases here. All right, so let's calculate this first case. All right, so the probability of rolling a 1 on a 6-sided die is 1 in 6. Okay, so I have to do this, and my opponent has to do this. So anytime we talk about 2 things having to happen at the same time in probability, we have to multiply. Okay, so we're going to multiply my 1/6 probability by this probability. Okay, now what's the probability of rolling a 5? Well, that's also 1 in 6. Or they could have rolled a 6. And anytime we talk about an or, especially one that's mutually exclusive, you know, i.e. can't happen at the same time, we do an add. And then the probability of rolling a 6 is 1 in 6. Okay, so that's my first case. This is one scenario that could happen. Another thing that could happen is this over here. So either this scenario could happen, or this scenario could happen. And what we just talked about is when you have an or, you add, and then the probability of me rolling a 2 is a 1 in a 6, and my opponent has to roll a 6, and means multiply. Okay, so these were the probabilities that my opponent outrolled me. And let's turn this into something meaningful here. All right, so let's go ahead and do this addition first. So 1/6 plus 1/6 is 2/6. And then if we multiply that by 1/6, we're going to get 2/36. All right, and then doing this over here, 1/6 times 1/6 is 1/36. All right, and then let's add these 2 numbers together. That'll give us 3/36, which is 1/12, which is roughly 8.33 continued percent. So my probability of losing that roll was about 8%, okay? Which is pretty decent, right? 1 out of 12, that's pretty good odds. Pretty good odds I'm going to score 2 points and keep that VP pressure up in the danger zone. Sorry, that was terrible. I will try not to do that again. All right, so that's one way we could have calculated this probability. Again, I wouldn't expect anyone to do that during the middle of the game. That's a jerk move, and I'm not advocating that at all. But that's one thing you could have done. And this is also fun if you're mathy and analysis. I would say I'm a math guy. I don't know my English. Okay, so that's one way you could have done this calculation in your armchair generaling, your Monday morning quarterbacking, whatever you want to call it. All right, now let's look at another way we could have done this. And I think this is going to be a way that's going to be a lot easier for people to do because it helps with visualization. And in all of my years of tutoring and teaching math, people often say that they're visual learners. So let's take a look at a visual here. All right, so what I've done here is I've made this chart. And let me see if I can center that up a little bit better in the frame. I've made this chart here to show all the possible outcomes that could have happened, okay? So this represents the US die roll, which remember doesn't get any pluses to it. And then these are what I could have rolled. And then this top is with my +3 added to it, okay? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to color in all of the situations in which I would have lost the roll, okay? This is my sample space, and I'm going to highlight the instances in which I would have lost, okay? So if I would have rolled a 1, which is like a 4, let's go down here and see which one of these I would have lost, all right? So if my opponent rolls a 1, I'm still good because I'm a lot higher. And if they roll a 2, I'm still good. 3, I'm good. 4, I'm good because remember, we don't re-roll ties. But if I rolled a 1 and they rolled a 5, I lose, okay? So let me go ahead and color that in. All right. And then if I rolled a 1 and they rolled a 6, 6 is greater than 4. So I also lose here. All right. What else? All right, so let's go to the next column. All right, and then kind of doing the same thing. If I roll a 5, or I roll a 2, which is a 5, they match here, right? I don't really need to go down this whole column, but here I tie, so I don't worry about that. I'm only worried about this case right here where they roll a 6 and I roll a modified 5. So this is an instance where I lose. All right, but if I roll a 3, which modified is a 6, there's no scenario here in where I lose. And then same thing in each of these. All right, so I've colored in all the cases in which I lose. Now let's add up the color, the number of boxes I've shaded, which is 3. Now how many boxes are there total? Well, this is a 6 by 6 grid, so 6 squared is 36, which is 1/12, which is 8.33%, which lines up with our front of the envelope estimation. Or I guess it wasn't an estimation, it was precise mathematical calculation. But there we go. There is how we could apply some statistics into helping us make this decision on whether or not it's worth risking a summit roll to not knock over the tripod. Gotta love recorded video. And I'm too lazy to edit that out, so enjoy that blooper. All right, so that's one way you can use some math and statistics to, help improve your decisions in risky situations like that. So now, how did it actually go down in real life? Okay, and I know everyone's on the edge of their seat thinking that I've gone through all this stuff to prove how that's a sane decision, but he ended up losing the game. Well, I'm happy to report that did not happen. My opponent rolled a 3 and I rolled like a 5, so I ended up getting the 2 VPs, kept my opponent in the danger zone. And then I ended up, but actually what was great, to put a cap on this story, fast forward one more turn, I get the VP marker up to 18, and then I actually did a really cool combo. We went into the headline phase, and I was able to headline "We Will Bury You," which allows me to score 3 points the next time my opponent would score a point. And then my very next card was Camp David Accords, which gave my opponent 1 VP. Now, I know some rules lawyers out there are going to be like, oh, well, he should have had a chance to play UN Intervention. And they're not wrong, but my opponent didn't have it, and we just agreed that, had I known that, we could have, finagled it to where I could have played that. So that was an interesting, cool card, 2-card combo that got me to the 20 points I needed. So that's how that game ultimately played out. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this first installment of Armchair General. I hope you didn't find the math too boring. I hope I presented it in an entertaining way, especially tying it to wargaming and board gaming in general. So I guess there's nothing else to add to that. So, yeah, we'll see you next time.